Today I've got a video on one of F1's nearly men, although to be a nearly man you need to nearly win the championship. Well, I guess it almost happened 2003, but either way, like the Williams BMW story I did a couple of weeks ago, this career in Formula 1 should have been brilliant, mega even, but it wasn't. Why? I'm starting to think of how many of these kinds of retrospective videos I've done. Maybe not so much retrospectives, but that's what people on YouTube call them, so I might as well carry on with that. I guess it's one of those words and phrases that people just end up using across the entirety of YouTube, across the platform, if you will. I watch quite a few of these gaming retrospective videos, and the person doing the narration will always use the term franchise over the word series. Resident Evil 2 is one of the best games in the franchise, and so on. Which it is, by the way, if not the best. Currently, I think I'm at 8. Trulli, Vettel's Ferrari years, Coulthard, Alesi, BMW Williams, Toyota, Jaguar and Frentzen. I have done other deep dives in the Downfall mini-series and that kind of thing, but those are drivers, teams or time periods that should have been amazingly good, but didn't reach their full potential. For whatever reason. Wrong place, wrong time, right place, wrong time, iffy career decisions, utterly baffling business decisions, the list goes on. And there's still a few more drivers to add to that list. Ralf Schumacher, Barrichello, Villeneuve, Herbert, Brundle, Massa, Raikkonen, just to name a few. Drivers who should have achieved more than they did, drivers held back by injury, or drivers in the shadow of their relatives or teammates. Today I'm going to add to the 9th of the should have been better than it was series, and that is Juan Pablo Montoya. I remember Montoya's name being thrown around as early as the late 1990s. He raced for Jackie Stewart's son's team in the lower categories in 1995 and then raced in British Formula 3 in 1996, where he finished 5th overall. Fun bonus fact for you, in the same series that year was one Christian Horner, and there was also Paula Cook, whose family owned the DC Cook car dealer network until it closed in 2009. Look for the DC Cook sign. Jesus, how do I remember that jingle? For reference, the season that year was won by Ralph Furman, and Montoya went up to the next category for 1997, which is Formula 3000. That later was GP2, and now Formula 2, and he was going to be racing for Helmut Marko's team. He lost the championship in his rookie year through mistakes, and was told to get his fitness in order because mentally he wasn't all there. While he was the highest placed rookie come the end of the season, he finished 2nd while Ricardo Zonta took the championship. In the November of 1997, Frank Williams signed him up as a test driver for the Williams Formula 1 team, and he also switched teams for the 1998 F3000 season, because he'd had a bit of a character clash with Marko. Montoya would battle with Nick Heidfeld through 1998 for the title. Also on the grid that year were future F1 drivers Stefan Sarazan, Gaston Mazzacane, Thomas Enger, is that how you pronounce it? And Christian Horner was racing that year too. Montoya would take the title with 65 points versus Heidfeld's 58, with both drivers being the class of the field. Horner was down in 33rd on 0 points, just for those wondering how he did. Despite this, Frank didn't think that Juan was ready for a Formula 1 seat in 1999, and because of him being contracted to Williams, potential seats at Jordan, Sauber, Stewart and Minardi evaporated. So in came Chip Ganassi, who Frank struck up a deal with to send Montoya to kart, while in return Williams would get the more experienced Alex Zanardi. It wasn't a particularly fruitful switch for Williams though, because Zanardi didn't score a single point through 1999, while Montoya won the kart season as a rookie. Well, he won on a tiebreaker because he and Franchitti were tied on points come the end. The following year Montoya would win the Indy 500, but Ganassi's advantage over the rest of the field had evaporated thanks to the chassis constructors and the engine suppliers achieving some sort of parity. This then left the championship wide open, and Montoya's success at the Indy 500 opened the floodgates for the other kart teams to make the switch to the IRL and helped solidify the demise of the series, as the two series were in the middle of their civil war. Montoya won 2 races and finished 9th before his exchange program with Ganassi ended. So Montoya was now in a Formula 1 car, but his arrival in Formula 1 was met with scepticism as well as intrigue. IndyCar imports typically hadn't done well when coming into Formula 1, but the F1 world still had fresh memories of Michael Andretti utterly tanking at McLaren, despite Williams winning the title with an IndyCar import just 4 years prior. There were questions of whether this was going to be another Andretti, who achieved very little, another Villeneuve in that he'd be a champion, or maybe a Dan Gurney, win a couple of races but never really get close to a championship. Any misgivings about his talent were wiped off at the Brazilian Grand Prix, when he used his rolling start experience to catch Schumacher with his pants down and romp off into a lead, only to be taken out by Jos Verstappen later on in the race. People at the time called it a glimmer of hope, Many were expecting Schumacher to be the dominant force of 2001, and he was already a good way ahead in the standings at this point, having already won the opening 2 rounds of the season. Montoya had turned up in Formula 1 and given zero fucks about who he'd just stuck the move on. He launched it in, squeezed the Michael out to the grass, and went off. I'm racking my brains as to who the next person to do that sort of thing would be, sticking it on an established driver like that as a rookie. Probably Hamilton when he went round the outside of Alonso at Melbourne in 2007, followed by Kobayashi on Button at Interlagos in 2009, 2010, whenever it was, and then Verstappen going round the outside of Blanchimont in 2015 or 16. Either way, he did that. So this was a guy who made people take notice. He didn't care who it was, he was going to race them. But the thing was, if Montoya wasn't being wiped out or wiping himself out, the car wasn't playing ball. It took Montoya 15 races to get his first win, with that win coming in front of the Tifosi, of all people. With Häkkinen heading off for his sabbatical and Coulthard just not having the same level of talent as Schumacher, it seemed Montoya would be the guy to stick it to, the Michael. His crashes and mistakes were put down to simply not being used to the cars in Formula 1. His cars were more prone to understeer due to the Michelins that year having a rubbish operating window, and at the Canadian Grand Prix of that year, his more explosive side was shown when he got into a spot of handbags with Jacques Villeneuve. Villeneuve had accused Montoya of blocking him in practice. Montoya was a bit miffed that Jacques had allegedly brake tested him, which caused Montoya to hit the back of the BAR that Villeneuve was driving. Montoya apparently then went for the jugular as he made a remark about the crash between Villeneuve and Schumacher at the Australian Grand Prix, which killed a marshal, and the two got into a little scuffle in the driver's briefing that Charlie Whiting had to break up. The FIA reprimanded both drivers and JP got one hell of a bollocking from Frank for it, but when Montoya hit Villeneuve, he must have broken the suspension or something, because JV tried to do some more laps, but then the suspension broke at high speed. Montoya said, "I don't know what he was thinking when he brake tested me, but in a way, he's paid for it." Bernie and Max must have been having kittens with this. Most people in the paddock were saying that it was Montoya to blame for kicking this whole thing off. Even Eddie Irvine was on JV's side. 2002 was the year that Montoya showed how rapid he could be over one lap. The problem is the races went on Sunday, and while the Williams and the Michelin tyres were great over one lap, well, the races went on Sunday, not on Saturday. He was on pole 7 times in the 2002 season, but the all-conquering F2002 driven by Schumacher went on to win the championship in then record time. But Juan was able to show his pace when he was given a bizarre penalty at the Malaysian Grand Prix. Long story short, Michael hit Montoya at the first corner and it wiped off Schumacher's front wing, but Montoya was penalised. Yeah, answer that. It's actually the first ever drive-through penalty issued to a driver. Fun facts everywhere in these videos. But despite having all those pole positions, the same amount of poles that Schumacher had, it has to be said, JPM couldn't convert any of them into a victory. His best result would be second, 4 times, but he did outscore his teammate Ralf Schumacher and had been doing so since the second half of 2001. Malaysia might have been a win if not for that utterly insane penalty given to him. I don't even know why they gave it to Montoya, even Schumacher was puzzled by it, and I think even the most die-hard of Schumacher fans would struggle to see how it was given. But still, during 2002 there were explosive moments, although nowhere near what they'd been through his debut season. Montoya had taken exception to Schumacher weaving around at the Brazilian Grand Prix where JP had actually hit the Ferrari, and during qualifying for the Belgian Grand Prix he'd called Raikkonen an idiot over the radio. Well, I mean, he did add some words that were a bit fruitier than idiot over the radio, but this is the long story short version. 2003 would be his best opportunity to win the Formula 1 World Championship. The car had been a bit temperamental in the opening part of the season, but by Monaco it had really come good. I don't want to just parrot everything I said in the Williams BMW video, but any problems that Williams and BMW had with the car had largely been ironed out. It has to be said as well that the previous year Montoya had taken pole at Monaco by over half a second, which is an utterly mental statistic. Despite being third on the grid, Montoya jumped Raikkonen in the McLaren off the line and got into second as he and Ralf led. Pressure was high on Williams and Montoya at this time, as JP hadn't won a race in over 20 months, not having a single win through 2002 and had already bottled the win at Melbourne that year. He'd also retired from the lead of the Austrian Grand Prix in 2003, so a win for Williams, BMW and Montoya was about as overdue as one of my school library books. After an early safety car to remove Frenson's wrecked car, the two Williams cars were helped by the Trulli train in behind Raikkonen to build a gap. When Ralf pitted on lap 21, Montoya put the mother of all laps in so that when he pitted, he'd have the lead, and got it. Raikkonen managed to jump Ralph in the pit stops too, and it would now be a fight between the Colombian and the Finn for the win. When the pit stop cycled towards the end of the race, it was Montoya leading from Raikkonen and Michael Schumacher. Montoya was also getting some readings on his steering wheel about engine problems and things like that, so he had to hold off both of them for the rest of the race, and they were closing in at a rate of about 3/4 of a second per lap. But this is Monaco. Getting past is completely different to catching up. Montoya finally got his second Grand Prix victory, and it's probably his best victory, soaking up the unbelievable pressure from Raikkonen and Schumacher in the latter stages of the race. The top three finished pretty much nose to tail, and on the hardest track of them all, Montoya managed to not put a foot wrong. In doing so, he'd proved to everybody that he could race, that he wasn't too emotional and not mentally good enough to handle Formula 1 pressure, and if things went right for the rest of the season, he could potentially win the championship, as Williams and McLaren had both got Ferrari's number that year. But it wasn't to be. On top of the rules regarding the tyres changing in September after a Ferrari protest, things weren't too happy behind the scenes. At the Nürburgring and Monaco, Ralph had won both races, which could have been wins for Montoya, and it would have meant he would have lost the championship by just a single point to Michael come the end. This is, assuming at the same time, the questionable penalty for him at Indianapolis is wiped off too, and he finished ahead of Michael there, which would have given him the title in 2003. But then again, he did bottle it in Australia, didn't he? But in reality though, Montoya was third, 11 points off Michael's winning total. Montoya wasn't particularly happy that Ralph had won those races, and it was his pit stop strategy that allowed Ralph to win those two races. When he expressed his displeasure over the radio, Williams, or somebody at Williams, clapped back, and then Montoya went on this expletive-laden rant, which nobody knows what he said because transcripts can't be found anywhere. So with the relationship now deteriorating at Williams, Montoya signed a deal with McLaren to start in 2005. He also got his head struck by a cameraman at some point during the season too. The cameraman was filming somebody going into the Ferrari motorhome and must have been too busy filming to notice that Montoya had entered the shot. Montoya walked in front of the cameraman, and the cameraman, who was walking towards the Ferrari motorhome, clanged into JP with the hard plastic corner of the lens cover, or whatever it is, I don't know what it's called. Either way, JP wasn't happy and repeatedly claimed that this man had broken his head. 2004 was a disaster for him and Williams. Not only had Ferrari got another world beater of a car, the FW26 wasn't up to scratch and suffered from a lack of downforce that wouldn't generate enough turning for Montoya to feel comfortable. The walrus-nosed Williams struggled and only became competitive when Williams abandoned the concept and switched to something a little more normal in design. While he scored points, the Ferraris were just too good, and his season was hampered by 2 disqualifications. One at Canada for having brake ducts that were just too big, and the second disqualification at Indianapolis because he changed cars on the starting grid too late. He did end the season with a win in Brazil though. Before moving to McLaren for 2005, Montoya lost a lot of weight and got much fitter in the off-season, but this was the season of the MP420, a glass cannon of a car that made a mid-60s Lotus look like last year's Red Bull, an unbelievably quick car that suffered from reliability issues and struggled to generate tyre temperature. While points were scored in the opening 2 races, he then had to miss 2 races and be replaced with Pedro de la Rosa and Alex Wurz because he'd been injured. He insisted that the hairline fracture on his scapula was from playing tennis, but there was a lot of rampant speculation in the paddock and in the media that he'd actually done it from falling off a motorbike. It was an accident that caused a few chuckles in the paddock and online as well. A broken shoulder blade from playing tennis. But at the same time, it opened up a lot of talk about why Ron Dennis, who is famously incredibly boring and protective of the McLaren brand, would allow his drivers to do such a thing away from the track. At the time, Schumacher, Fisichella, Alonso and Trulli were keen football players and would often play charity games, risking a broken ankle or a broken leg. Nigel Mansell was actually injured playing football at a race weekend, while Mark Webber is thought to have lost a world championship while hiding an injury from Red Bull after he came off his road bike in Tasmania. Now though, in this era of protocols and things like that, Ollie Askew lost his IndyCar seat for trying to hide a concussion. But whether it was tennis or motocross, tensions were developing between Montoya and Dennis. Montoya insisted that the injury had been caused by playing tennis. He'd stepped on a ball that he hadn't seen, slipped over and landed on his back. But everybody was convinced that it was a motocross accident, but there's been no proof. When he came back, he probably wasn't fully recovered enough. It took him a while to find some form, and he finally found it when he won the British Grand Prix and got a podium in Germany and Turkey. The Italian Grand Prix was also a win, and he would get a final win in Brazil. After all of that, it was good enough for 4th in the championship. It also didn't help that the car was built for Raikkonen and Montoya liked a different setup, so he could find the car utterly awful at times. But 2006 was going to be it for Montoya's Formula 1 career. The switch to V8s wasn't something he could get used to, and it was already known that Alonso was going to be coming in for 2007. McLaren hadn't exercised their option on Montoya for 2007, given that the relationship between him and Dennis and Whitmarsh had completely deteriorated. Montoya underperformed through the season, and the lack of pace from McLaren certainly helped with his desire to get out, ultimately being sacked when he wiped himself and Kimi out at Indianapolis. So he was out of Formula 1. He was bored with the politics, he was bored of the corporate nature, he was bored of Dennis, he was bored of, well, basically everything, because he just wanted to get into a car and rag it. Just take it right up to the ragged edge. So after he was kicked out of Formula 1, well, kicked out of McLaren anyway, he signed a deal with Chip Ganassi to race in NASCAR, of all places. And in doing so, he opened the door for Lewis Hamilton. It's mental how all this crosses over, isn't it? So did Montoya underperform in Formula 1? Yes, to an extent. Racing Formula 1 cars wasn't the same as racing kart cars, and that transition was a little hard to adjust to. There's also the politics, the massively corporate world that wouldn't be compatible with his outbursts, but there's also the fact that when he came into the sport, he was up against one of the greatest drivers to ever sit in a Formula 1 car. But despite the outbursts, the colourful language, the tantrums and the mistakes, he was unbelievably fast and a driver who didn't care who you were or how many championships you won. He was here to race, and he was going to race a guy at the back of the grid as hard as he'd race someone at the front of the grid. His ability to throw a car into a corner and make everybody take notice by launching one on Schumacher in only his 3rd Grand Prix allowed the world to see this guy who wouldn't back down from a fight. And his personality and driving style divided people as much as Schumacher did. You either liked the guy, or you didn't. There's a lot of stuff that he said and did that will make you cringe. They make me cringe, and I'm a huge fan of the guy. There's also stuff that he said that was just completely not necessary. The alleged comment he made to Villeneuve about the marshal that was killed at the Australian Grand Prix in 2001. That's why I'm saying alleged, because it's not actually been proven what was said. But there's no denying the fact that on his day, the guy was utterly rapid. But this is the problem. Being world class on your day doesn't make you world class. If everything worked in his favour, then he had absolutely demon speed that was just scary on all fronts. If the car didn't work, he looked like everybody else. It makes you wonder if he'd had those 2 Ferraris in 2002 and 2004, or if his McLaren had worked properly in 2005 without his injury, or if his Williams had been just a tiny bit better in the early stages of 2003. It gets scarier and scarier to think about. He was certainly one of my favourites growing up, probably because he stuck 2 fingers up to the Michael, and when he was dominating, that's what people wanted to see. But at the same time, he wasn't afraid to say what he thought, and was completely no filter. And as F1 was really entering this new corporate world with money and everything else just skyrocketing and all the manufacturers getting involved, it certainly was a breath of fresh air on all fronts. But I'll leave it to you to discuss in the comments how good this guy actually was. So then, a look at one of my favourite drivers in Juan Pablo Montoya. If this has opened up some core memories, then do like the video so I know a good job was done, and for more like this, get subscribed and get that bell on too so you never miss out on any future videos. Massive thanks to the fine bunch of lads over at Patreon who continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help out with things around here, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs that you might want or need to know. There's also super thanks if you want to buy me a coffee, and memberships if you just want a Patreon alternative. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.